Trucker Horror Story. A True Horror Story. Introduction. Jack Harper had spent the last 20 years hauling freight across America. Known as Iron Jack among fellow truckers, he was a man of few words and even fewer fears. Jack prided himself on taking the jobs no one else would. Long hours, treacherous roads, and even the odd night shift through eerie, desolate landscapes. One fateful evening, Jack was stationed at a truck stop in Kansas, sipping coffee while waiting for a routine call. Just as he was about to call it a night, a dispatcher offered him a lucrative but urgent delivery, a load of industrial equipment to a site 400 miles away. The catch? The route cut through Route 66, a stretch notorious among locals for its ghost stories. Jack laughed it off. Ghosts? He'd seen more danger in real life than he believed existed in any ghost story. Without hesitation, he accepted the job. "You're braver than most," said an old man at the diner counter. "Watch out for the hitchhiker." Jack smirked and tipped his hat. "I'll take my chances." The journey begins. The first few hours were uneventful. Jack cruised under the blanket of stars, his rig humming steadily. But as he passed the last sign of civilization, a dimly lit gas station, he felt a strange chill creep up his spine. The radio, usually a comforting companion, began to flicker with static. "Must be the hills," Jack muttered, fiddling with the dial. But no matter the station, all he heard was distorted whispers, like a conversation just out of earshot. Shrugging it off, Jack focused on the road. Yet, his mind couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His eyes darted to the mirrors, catching fleeting glimpses of shadows that seemed to move just out of view. The hitchhiker hours later, Jack noticed something unusual ahead. A figure standing by the side of the road, arm outstretched for a ride. It was rare to see anyone this far out, especially at this hour. Against his better judgment, Jack slowed down. The hitchhiker was a gaunt man in his 40s, wearing a tattered coat and carrying an old duffel bag. His face was pale and his eyes seemed unnaturally dark. "Need a lift?" Jack asked through the window. The man nodded silently and climbed into the cab. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Jack tried to make small talk, but the hitchhiker was eerily quiet. He only spoke in vague, cryptic sentences, often referring to things Jack hadn't mentioned. "You've been doing this a long time, haven't you, Jack?" Jack's grip tightened on the wheel. "How'd you know my name?" The hitchhiker smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Lucky guess." The truth revealed as the night wore on. The tension in the cab grew unbearable. The radio's whispers returned, growing louder and more frantic. The hitchhiker began to hum an old, haunting tune that Jack couldn't place. Finally, Jack snapped. "Who are you?" The hitchhiker turned to him, his face now distorted and unrecognizable. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his voice became guttural. "I'm the last thing you'll ever see, Jack." The truck screeched to a halt as Jack slammed on the brakes. The hitchhiker laughed, a bone-chilling sound, and vanished into thin air. The fight for survival thinking. He was free. Jack started driving again, but the terror was far from over. The truck's headlights began to flicker, and the engine groaned as if under strain. A dense fog enveloped the road, and Jack realized he was no longer on Route 66. The landscape had changed. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes, and the road seemed endless. In the mirrors, Jack saw figures running alongside the truck, their faces twisted in agony. Desperate, Jack remembered the old stories about the phantom hitchhiker. He grabbed a crucifix his mother had given him years ago and clutched it tightly. "You're not taking me!" he shouted. The truck cabin erupted in chaos. The phantom reappeared, clawing at Jack, but he held his ground. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack veered off the road, crashing into a ditch. The aftermath. When Jack regained consciousness, it was morning. He was slumped over the wheel, the truck's front end smashed against a tree. A highway patrol officer was tapping on the window. "You're lucky to be alive," the officer said. "People have gone missing on this stretch of road for years." Jack never spoke of what happened that night, but he abandoned trucking soon after. He became a vocal advocate for avoiding Route 66, warning anyone who would listen about the dangers lurking there. Moral: the story of Trucker reminds us that not all warnings are baseless, and that dismissing folklore can sometimes have dire consequences. Respect the unknown, for it might hold truths we are not prepared to face. He buried her alive. A true horror story. Introduction. Horror is not merely about the unseen shadows in the dark or the inexplicable noises in the night. Sometimes, the most terrifying horrors lie within the depths of the human psyche. This story explores the dreadful consequences of deceit, greed, and vengeance, culminating in a haunting tale of poetic justice. He Buried Her Alive is not only a spine-chilling narrative, but also a grim reminder that actions often echo louder than intentions, leaving behind imprints that cannot be erased. The story, Chapter 1. The Pact in the small, isolated town of Hollow Creek. James Harrington was a man of considerable wealth and influence. He had inherited a vast fortune from his father and managed to expand the family business with ruthless efficiency. But beneath the veneer of charm and success lay a man consumed by greed and ambition. James's wife, Eleanor, was the antithesis of her husband. Gentle, kind, and loved by all, she had married James believing in his promises of love and security. Little did she know that she was merely a pawn in his grand scheme. James had recently discovered that Eleanor was the sole heir to her late grandmother's vast estate, an inheritance that would make him one of the wealthiest men in the state. However, there was a condition. Eleanor had to be alive and married to James for the property to transfer fully into his hands. Chapter 2. The deception. James devised a plan so sinister it would make even the most hardened criminals shudder. He began to poison Eleanor's mind with tales of ghosts and hauntings, insisting that the house they lived in was cursed. Eleanor, already frail from her recent illness, grew increasingly paranoid. One night, James took things a step further. He staged an elaborate haunting. Footsteps in the hall, whispers in the dark, and objects moving inexplicably. Eleanor was terrified. "We must leave this place, James," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. James feigned concern, but his plan was nearing fruition. He convinced Eleanor that the only way to rid herself of the curse was to undergo a spiritual burial, a ritual he claimed would cleanse her soul and free her from the hauntings. Chapter 3. The Burial. In a secluded part of the woods behind their mansion, James had prepared a shallow grave. He led Eleanor there under the pretense of the ritual. She was hesitant, but trusted her husband, unaware of the darkness lurking within him. "I'll be right here with you," James assured her, holding her hand as she lay down in the wooden coffin he had prepared. "This will only take a few hours. You'll wake up feeling renewed." As Eleanor closed her eyes, James nailed the coffin shut, his heart pounding not with guilt, but with anticipation. He buried her alive, confident that her screams would be muffled by the earth. He told himself she wouldn't suffer long. The air would run out soon enough. Chapter 4. The Awakening the next morning. James went about his day as if nothing had happened. He contacted Eleanor's lawyer and began the process of claiming the inheritance. But as the night fell, an eerie sense of unease settled over him. The mansion seemed colder, darker. Around midnight, James heard a faint tapping sound. He dismissed it as his imagination, but the noise grew louder and more persistent. Then came the whispers, a soft, chilling voice that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "You buried me, James. I trusted you." James froze. Sweat dripped down his face as he turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was Eleanor, her face pale, her eyes hollow, her dress covered in dirt. Chapter 5. The Retribution. Terrified, James stumbled backward. "You're dead! This can't be real!" he screamed. Eleanor advanced slowly, her voice a haunting whisper. "You thought you could silence me, but the dead don't rest when justice is left undone." James tried to run, but the mansion seemed to transform into a maze. Every door he opened led back to Eleanor, her apparition more terrifying each time. Her voice grew louder, echoing in his ears, drowning out his thoughts. "You will feel the earth's weight, James. You will know what it's like to suffocate, to beg for mercy that will never come." In his desperation, James fled into the woods. The ground beneath him seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. He tripped and fell, landing in the very spot where he had buried Eleanor. The earth gave way, and James was pulled into the shallow grave. As the dirt closed over him, James's screams were muffled, just as Eleanor's had been. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. Days later, the townsfolk discovered James's body in the woods. The official cause of death was asphyxiation, though no one could explain how he had ended up buried alive. Eleanor's body was never found, and her inheritance was donated to charity as per her will. The mansion in Hollow Creek was abandoned, left to decay. Locals claimed to hear whispers and see ghostly figures in the woods at night, but no one dared venture near. Moral of the story: greed and betrayal are paths that lead to ruin. When we exploit trust for selfish gain, we invite consequences that go beyond the mortal realm. He buried her alive serves as a chilling reminder that justice, though delayed, is inevitable. Trust is sacred, and those who desecrate it may find themselves haunted by the echoes of their own sins.